In this video, I'm going to talk about how to repay the loan if you were using the buy, borrow, die tax planning strategy. So I personally think boob or die is the best tax and investment strategy that you can use. I have been working my entire career with wealthy people, with people who are some of the wealthiest people in this country, to people who you know only have a couple $1 million, $5 million, $10 million. All across the range of people who have been using this strategy in a way that they can build wealth efficiently while paying little to no tax. So before I start, I want to be clear that I do recognize that this strategy is not for everyone. I've been getting a lot of kind of crazy comments. I see a lot of crazy things said about buy, borrow, die. There's people who just don't get it, and there's people who just don't really understand how to use the strategy. I will be the first to admit it is not for everyone. Personally, it is my favorite strategy, but I understand that if you're new to financial concepts, if you're someone who just doesn't believe in using good debt for investment purposes, or just at any point if you're someone who needs to pay off your mortgage so that you can sleep at night, if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of money, if you're very new in your journey and you just don't have a big portfolio of assets or a lot of net worth, then this is not the time to do that. So this strategy is not for everyone, but just because it's not for you doesn't mean it doesn't work. I see people saying buy, borrow, die doesn't work. For various reasons that are wrong, I have been working my entire career with people to implement this strategy. I have been using this strategy myself. Yes, we were in a higher interest rate environment at the time I'm recording this video, but this strategy still works if you know what you're doing. So you may see people say things like buy, borrow, die doesn't work because you could never own, you never want to own the same company for your entire life or interest. Rates are too high, and they're quoting some crazy interest rates that nobody that knows what they're doing is paying on anything right now. So make sure that you understand what you're doing. Make sure you think about the strategy, learn about it. Is this the right strategy for you? You either kind of get it, you either buy into this methodology and way of thinking about investments and tax planning, or you don't. And so I understand it's not for everyone. Yes, you need to be careful. There is a loan involved, and I've gotten a lot of questions about how do you repay that loan? How do you make the interest payment? So let's talk a little about how you can think about that if you're going to think about using the strategy. For recap, what is the buy, borrow, die strategy? Yourself. So to start with, I want to be clear about buy, borrow, die. I have a lot of videos on this. I'll link below to my main video. It's a very long video, but it's important that you understand this. If you can't spend 40 minutes, watching a video to understand the most important tax planning strategy that exists, then I'm not sure that my channel is the right one for you. You really have to invest the time to learn this. Buy, borrow, die is so critically important. It is not something that they teach you in school. It is not something your CPA or financial advisor is ever going to tell you about. This is something your rich uncle or your wealthy aunt is going to know. This is not something you're going to hear about from anybody else, and a lot of people don't understand it or really understand how to use it. So I'm just going to start. I'm not going to dive into what buy, borrow, die is in any detail. I have a very long video on that. So if you haven't seen that, check that out. You should understand what the strategy is first, but really it's just a 3-step process. First, you're going to buy an asset. Needs to be an asset you own long term. There are tons of types of assets that I am happy to own for the rest of my life, that I do own, and yes, there's tons of assets that I wouldn't want to own for the rest of my life, so I'm not going to use those for buy, borrow, die. Buy, borrow, die. Step 1. Buy an asset you're willing to own for a long term. And I mean a very long time. I'm talking 10, 20, 30 years. You know I own assets that I never plan to sell in my entire life. Then if you want to access appreciation or whatever you want to diversify your investments, you cash out whatever it is you're going to borrow against that asset. Instead of selling the asset and paying tax on it, you're going to borrow against that asset, so then you continue to hold that asset throughout your life. And so then you've been able to access the appreciation that asset by borrowing against it and getting that cash and doing whatever you want with that cash, but you still own the underlying asset. When you die, there's going to be what's called a step up in basis in the value of your asset. So your heirs, if that's your children, are going to inherit that asset, and they can turn around on day one that they receive that asset, sell that asset, and pay zero tax, income tax on that gain. Yes, I know there's other taxes. There's estate tax, there's property taxes, there's all kinds of taxes. I'm not dealing with those here. There are definitely strategies to mitigate those. We are talking about income tax, obviously. So what you're going to do is buy an asset, own that asset for the rest of your. Jeff Bezos built Amazon and became a billionaire without paying any tax. This is how Elon Musk has used the strategy. This is how real estate investors like Robert Kiyosaki. He's one of the first people that really talked about buy, borrow, die. In any kind of, intelligent way where you could see that he really understood the strategy. This is how these people use this strategy to build massive amounts of wealth while paying zero tax on that money. But it also allows you to take advantage of the appreciation that asset by borrowing against it and using that cash to do other things. So that leads us to the how do I repay the loan question that I keep getting, which is how do I repay the loan? So this might not be a super satisfying answer, but that depends on how you're using the strategy. You can use buy, borrow, die for a lot of different things. You can use it against your business. You can, the Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk way. You can use it against real estate, the Robert Kiyosaki way. You can use it against stock portfolios with SBLOCs. You can do, anything that you can borrow from against. You could technically do BU borrow die with, if that asset is something you're willing to own for your life. So when you're thinking about how you repay the loan and when I say repay, I'm also how you have to pay interest. This is a loan. Yes, BU borrow die does involve taking out a loan against an asset. So you need to think about how you're going to repay it, how you're going to pay the interest on it. That's not super controversial. We know there's a loan, we've got to think about how to handle it. There are different ways the loans work depending on how you're using the strategy, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next slide, with some of the most common ways of using the strategy. But I want to be clear, I don't care how you repay the loan. I don't care how you pay the interest. I don't care if you're getting money from your Aunt Sally. I don't care if you're paying it with your business income. I don't care if you have a W-2 job and you're paying it with your salary. When you go out and take a mortgage on your home, nobody's sitting here asking how you repay that mortgage or how you service the interest. You've got to have disposable money or a way to repay that loan or pay the interest if you're required to make current payments of that. So it does not matter what you don't want to do is borrow against asset 1, invest in asset 2 in a way that it's tax inefficient and that you're, paying a bunch of tax on that secondary source of income. So people keep saying, well, you've got to pay tax on your secondary source of income. No, you don't. You can make investments where you don't pay tax. I don't understand why we all make this basic assumption that if we're going to make money from something, we've got to pay tax on it. That is not true, unless you're someone who's going to have a very tax inefficient way. The important matter is that you know what you're doing. You've got to be careful. This strategy is not for everyone. If you're new to these concepts, it may seem basic, like these steps are pretty simple, but in practice, it can be more complicated. This is what more sophisticated investors are doing. You have to understand what assets are safe to own long-term. Do you have the ability? Are you going to have a liquidity issue? You need to know what you're doing. If this is the first time you're learning about buy, borrow, die, you're not ready yet. You really have to understand the ins and outs of this strategy. You've got to study the details, model it yourself. Understand what investments are safe for long-term and what aren't. You have to grasp what you're doing to avoid getting into trouble with debt. Most people are scared of debt and avoid it, but good debt is necessary. When you know what you're doing, it is riskier not to use good debt if you have access to low-cost borrowing. With buy, borrow, die, you usually have good access to low-cost borrowing if you want to maximize the strategy's potential. The best practice with buy, borrow, die varies. There are different ways to perform this strategy, and they operate differently. We'll discuss common strategies and how to repay the loan. Jeff Bezos is borrowing against his Amazon shares to fund his lifestyle, which is very different. He's also investing by borrowing against Amazon to diversify his holdings because you don't want all your money in one stock. People borrow against their business or stocks to pay personal expenses like rent or mortgage. You need to be very careful. I'm not saying don't do it. I have done that before. My rent is extremely high because I live in New York City, but you need to be cautious. Best practice, especially if you're new, is to redeploy the cash at a higher rate of return than the interest you're paying. It's an arbitrage play called the double debt approach. If I can borrow at 5% and invest to get 15 or 20%, then I'm net ahead. I'm happy to pay 5% interest if my investments beat that. It is easy to make safe investments. They don't always hit the returns that you expect, but they should the vast majority of the time. If you're not getting 10% returns on investment, then you're not doing it right. Making at least 10% returns is essential for a good investment. The way this works is best practice. Borrow against asset 1, invest in asset 2 on a post-tax basis. On a post-tax basis, the return needs to exceed the interest cost on the loan with respect to asset 1. Exceeding by a good bit builds a cushion. Buy, borrow, die is the best practice strategy. Run common variations through different strategies to maximize investment effectiveness. Starting with the SB lock, a loan against your public securities. If you have a brokerage account of securities, you can borrow against them at a very low cost of interest. It is always about the lowest cost of interest you can have. Currently, I'm paying just over 6% pre-tax on my SB lock. SB locks rates should always be comparable to mortgage rates, which are usually the lowest cost financing available. If I were to buy a business, the first thing I would do is look at an SB lock. Take out the loan as much as possible for the lowest cost financing. SB locks are unique because you are not required to make current interest or principal payments, allowing you to keep the loan outstanding. With an SB lock, if I take out a $100,000 loan against my portfolio, I can keep that $100,000 outstanding without immediate repayments. No, a lot of people, especially with rates being, 6%, that's a lot higher than a lot of us are used to. I used to pay lower, less than 2%. Back when rates were really low during COVID times. But people like to pay the interest when it's higher, and some people they need to pay the interest, just psychologically so. How are you going to pay the interest? Well, I don't really care. Some people can let their dividends start to pay the interest. It's not going to cover it all right now, because right now, your interest rate's going to be higher than the dividend rate, most likely the rate of dividends that you're getting on your portfolio. So, that's probably not going to do it completely for you. You could use any other type of income if you're going to borrow against your ESP lock. I'll link to a video below where I use an example of where you take an SB lock to invest in a real estate fund. You can use that income from that real estate fund to partially pay off the interest and still have net profit at the end of the day. So check out that video for a good example of how you can do it and do it tax efficiently on both ends, both asset 1 and 2. But that's how SP locks work. They're unique in the sense that you don't have to make current interest or principal payments. A lot of people do this with business loans, so this gets a lot more risky. You have to be more sophisticated. You have to have a decent business that you know someone's willing to loan to you against. This is the strategy that Jeff Bezos used. It's kind of a combination of 1 and 2, because Amazon, those are public companies that we're talking about here. But you're borrowing against the business, whether it's assets, inventory, whatever it is, in order to, take some cash off the table. You can take that money, invest it in something else. You can use it to pay your personal expenses if you're, being very careful. But in that case, how do I pay the business loan? Well, if your business is profitable enough, I would start by looking at business profits, Could you pay the interest in the loan with your current business profits? If you're doing this is kind of the Elon Musk strategy, where you borrow against business 1 to invest in business 2 or start business 2. Hopefully pretty quickly, the net profits of business 2 can repay that loan that you have with respect to business 1. So, no, again, I don't care how you repay the loan, but hopefully you're redeploying the cash in a way that secondary investment is going to repay well in excess, repay the interest and principal payments on the loan, or, you just have other disposable income available to you. I know a lot of people who, use this strategy are actually W-2 employees, so they're getting very tax and efficient income in the first place, but they're going without knowing your personal situation. I can't advise you on the best way to do it, but hopefully you're not taking on a loan you can't afford. But also hopefully you're not taking the money from the loan and investing that in a tax-efficient way, or in a way that you're not going to get returns that exceed the debt, which should be easy to do. The third strategy is real estate buy, borrow, die. This is what I think about Robert Kiyosaki. He's the guy who wrote Rich Dad, Poor Dad. This is the way someone like him would think about this. This is the way some of the wealthiest real estate investors invest in a way that again, real estate, you want to buy properties that you're willing to own for long-term life. However, own them as long as possible. Ideally buy, borrow, die. You want to die, so owning the property, but you take out a mortgage against the property. So maybe, for example, I want to go buy a new property, so this property one's doing well, and I'm ready to extract the equity. It's increased in value. Say you bought it at 100 grand, and now it's worth 200 grand several years down the road, and I want to be able to get the benefit of the fact that property is appreciated so much value, but I don't want to pay tax from selling it. So what I'm going to do is we call that cash out refi. So you refinance, take out more of the equity in the property. Leave as little as possible. Is equity, extract out, a bigger mortgage. Take that money, invest in something else. You might want to go buy property 2, for example. And then, how do you repay that loan on property 1? Well, the rental income from the property is the first place I would look. Either property 1 or 2 again, it doesn't matter. But hopefully when you're getting a bunch more money out of the property by doing the cash out refinance, you're going to be able to go buy a nicer property that should be netting you even more. So that's the first place I would look to repay the loan. It doesn't mean that you have to do that, but you want to think about, again, taking that investment, cashing out the appreciation and investment 1, and investing it into investment 2 in a way that you can service the debt and still net a profit at the end of the day. This is very easy. Again, people who tell you this can't be done don't understand the strategy. The strategy has been being done for years and years. It is the best strategy out there that the most sophisticated investors are doing. So you need to just understand what you're doing. You need to study it. You need to find smart investments that you're willing to own and that can net you the returns that you're looking for. Last, I just want to talk about the double dip approach. Double dip approach, as I mentioned on the first slide. This is the best way to use buy, borrow, die. Especially if you are new to this. Then I definitely wouldn't you. To pay the interest on it, so think about, if you check out my video where I do SBCK to real estate fund, there I'm going to borrow. I'm going to take out A and B lock, say 1. 10,000 SB lock right now. I'm paying about 6% pre-tax is going to be less than that post-tax because I am going to get a tax deduction for that interest, and I'm investing that in a real estate fund, for example. That real estate fund is kicking off returns that are far exceeding that 6% interest that I have to pay. So I am not only able to service the interest payments, but I'm also able to put more cash into my pocket. Not only am I getting more cash in my pocket from this strategy, I now get the benefit of appreciation in 2 assets. So I still own asset 1, and I still own it. So any appreciation the asset increases my net worth further. And now I own asset 2, so as the underlying real estate that is owned through the fund appreciate. So does my net worth. So this is the beauty, or one of the million great things about strategy, is that not only am I pocketing more cash after servicing the debt, paying the interest on my block, I am also increasing my net worth every year. People may say things like, well, you've got to pay tax on that second investment. No, I don't. For my real estate funds, I've got my passive investment set up in a way that I, never pay tax. There would have to be some major, thing I wasn't prepared for me to ever have to pay tax on my passive income and my investments, is what I mean by that. So don't take an SBA lock and go invest in something. Well, a bond wouldn't make sense because returns aren't high enough. But don't take something like an SBA lock and then go buy something that's tax inefficient. Yes, that's going to be bad. You don't want to pay tax, right? But you got to be looking at returns on an after-tax basis. If the returns on investment to after-tax well exceed the interest you're paying on that SBOC, or whatever the loan is on investment 1, then that is when the strategy really works. And yes, it still works in the current environment. I am happy to borrow at 6% all day long to use this strategy. Don't let people tell you that interest rates were too high for this to work. Maybe I'm not going out and taking a business loan right now. I would still use it on real estate. Because you can still get, 6% mortgages on properties in some cases, but you probably want to, refinance those quickly once interest rates go down. But the strategy still works on Maya's lock. I'm still doing it. I'm not paying it down, and it still works, but you have to know what you're doing. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully, this starts to answer some questions on how to think about repaying the loan if you're going to do buy, borrow, die again. This is the best tax planning strategy. I hope you'll go to learn more about this strategy. Watch my other videos on it.